Hey guys, tonight we begin with something your history teacher deliberately left out of the textbooks. We're diving into 50 medieval secrets that schools never told you, the dark, bizarre, and uncomfortable truths about life in the Middle Ages that don't fit the sanitized narrative of knights and castles. Forget the fairy tales. Forget the romantic notions of chivalry and honor. The medieval world was stranger, crueler, and more fascinating than anything you learned in a classroom. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what we're about to explore isn't just history, but the raw, unfiltered reality of a 1,000-year period that shaped the world we live in today. These aren't just facts. They're pieces of the past that were buried, overlooked, or quietly forgotten, waiting for us to uncover them again. The medieval period lasted roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century, a span of 1,000 years that we've compressed into a few sanitized chapters in history books. But those chapters left out the most interesting parts. The parts that make you uncomfortable. The parts that challenge everything you thought you knew. Tonight, we're going to uncover those secrets, one by one, until the medieval world stands before you in all its brutal, bizarre glory. Let's start with something that sounds like it came from a nightmare. In medieval Europe, if you were accused of a crime, you didn't get a fair trial with evidence and witnesses. You got trial by ordeal, a system that assumed God would intervene to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Imagine this. You're accused of stealing from your neighbor. You claim you're innocent, but your word isn't enough. So the local priest heats a bar of iron in a fire until it glows red, then places it in your hands. You have to carry this burning metal for 9 feet while everyone watches. Your hands blister and burn. The smell of your own flesh cooking filling the air. But that's not the end. Your hands are then bandaged and sealed with the priest's mark. 3 days later, the bandages are removed. If your wounds are healing cleanly, you're innocent. God has protected you. If they're infected and festering, you're guilty. God has judged you. This wasn't some rare occurrence. Trial by ordeal was standard legal practice across medieval Europe for centuries. There were variations, each more horrifying than the last. Trial by water involved being bound and thrown into a river or pond. If you floated, you were guilty, because pure water rejected sinners. If you sank, you were innocent. Of course, if you sank, you also drowned, but at least you died with your reputation intact. Trial by combat was another option, where the accused and the accuser would fight, and whoever won was deemed to be in the right. This system heavily favored the strong and the skilled, meaning justice had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with who could swing a sword better. The most disturbing aspect of trial by ordeal wasn't the physical torture, it was the psychological manipulation. The church convinced people that God was actively participating in these trials, that divine intervention was real and observable. People genuinely believed that an innocent person's wounds would heal miraculously, that God would literally reach down and protect the righteous. But here's the secret your history teacher never mentioned. The priests often rigged the trials. They knew who was guilty and who wasn't, based on local gossip and their own investigations. When they wanted someone to be found innocent, they'd use a cooler iron or allow the accused to prepare their hands with protective salves. When they wanted someone found guilty, they'd use the hottest iron possible and ensure the wounds became infected. The church had absolute power over the legal system, and trial by ordeal was one of their most effective tools for maintaining that power. It wasn't about justice. It was about control, about making people believe that God spoke through the church, that the priests had a direct line to divine judgment. Trial by ordeal was finally abolished in 1215 when Pope Innocent III forbade priests from participating in these rituals. But the practice continued in some regions for decades afterward. So ingrained was the belief that God would intervene in human affairs. The legacy of trial by ordeal lives on in our language, When we say someone is going through an ordeal, we're referencing this medieval practice, this system of torture disguised as justice. Every time you use that word, you're invoking 1,000 years of suffering, of innocent people burned and drowned and beaten in the name of God. Here's something that will shock you. Medieval people had better teeth than their Victorian descendants. Yes, you read that right. The peasants of the Middle Ages, living in what we consider squalor, had healthier mouths than the refined ladies and gentlemen of the 19th century. The reason is simple: sugar. Medieval Europeans had almost no access to refined sugar. It was a rare luxury, imported from the Middle East at enormous cost, available only to the wealthiest nobles. The average person's diet consisted of coarse bread, vegetables, and occasionally meat. These foods, while not exactly delicious, didn't rot teeth the way sugar does. Archaeological evidence backs this up. When researchers examine medieval skeletons, they find teeth that are worn down from chewing coarse bread, but they're largely free of cavities. The enamel is intact, the roots are healthy, and many people died with most of their teeth still in their mouths. Compare this to Victorian skeletons, and the difference is stark. By the 19th century, sugar had become cheap and widely available. People consumed it in tea and cakes and candies and everything, and their teeth rotted accordingly. Victorian skulls show rampant tooth decay, abscesses, and tooth loss at young ages. But medieval people weren't completely free of dental problems. They had other issues, like tooth wear from grinding grain. Medieval flour was made by crushing grain between stones, and tiny particles of stone would end up in the flour. Every loaf of bread contained microscopic bits of rock, and over a lifetime of eating this bread, people's teeth would be ground down to nubs. They also suffered from gum disease, caused by poor oral hygiene and a lack of understanding about bacteria. But they did try to clean their teeth. They used twigs with frayed ends as toothbrushes, scrubbing their teeth with these primitive tools. They also used cloths dipped in salt or herbs to clean their mouths. Some medieval dental practices were surprisingly advanced. Barber-surgeons, who performed both haircuts and medical procedures, would extract rotten teeth using iron pliers. They had no anesthesia, so patients would be held down while the tooth was yanked out, often breaking in the process. But extraction was sometimes necessary to prevent infections from spreading. Medieval people also understood that certain foods and practices were bad for teeth. They knew that sweet foods caused problems, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. They knew that chewing on hard objects could crack teeth. They passed this knowledge down through generations, creating a folk wisdom about dental care that was surprisingly accurate. The irony is that as Europe became more civilized, as people gained access to refined foods and luxury goods, their health actually declined in some ways. The medieval peasant, eating his coarse bread and drinking his weak beer, had better teeth than the Victorian gentleman sipping tea with sugar. This secret challenges our assumptions about progress, about the linear march from barbarism to civilization. Sometimes the old ways were better. Sometimes poverty protected people from the diseases of wealth. In medieval Europe, animals could be arrested, tried, and executed for crimes. This wasn't a joke or a symbolic gesture. These were real legal proceedings, with lawyers, witnesses, and formal verdicts. Animals were held to the same legal standards as humans, and when they transgressed, they faced the full weight of medieval justice. The most common defendants were pigs. Pigs roamed freely through medieval towns, acting as living garbage disposals, eating the refuse that people threw into the streets. But sometimes, a pig would attack a child, and when that happened, the pig would be arrested and put on trial. The trial would follow the same procedures as a human trial. The pig would be kept in jail, sometimes in the same cell as human prisoners. A lawyer would be appointed to defend the pig, arguing that it was acting on instinct, that it couldn't understand right from wrong. The prosecution would present evidence of the pig's crime, calling witnesses who saw the attack. If the pig was found guilty, it would be sentenced to death. But not just any death. The pig would be dressed in human clothing, sometimes a full outfit with a jacket and pants, and then publicly executed, usually by hanging. The execution would be carried out in the town square, with crowds gathering to watch the pig swing from the gallows. This wasn't limited to pigs. rats were put on trial for destroying crops. In 1522, a swarm of rats in autumn France was formally charged with destroying the barley harvest. The rats were summoned to court, and when they failed to appear, their lawyer argued that the summons was invalid because the rats couldn't read and because the town's cats posed a danger to his clients. The case dragged on for months, with legal arguments about jurisdiction and proper notification procedures. Insects were also prosecuted. In 1478, a swarm of beetles was put on trial in Switzerland for destroying crops. The beetles were found guilty and officially banished from the region. The sentence was read aloud in the fields, as if the beetles could understand and would obey. Even larger animals faced justice. In 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets were tried for murdering a child. The sow was found guilty and executed, but the piglets were acquitted due to their youth and their mother's bad influence. They were released back to their owner, who had to pay court costs. These trials served multiple purposes. On one level, they were about maintaining social order, about demonstrating that justice applied to all creatures, not just humans. On another level, they were about giving communities a sense of control over the unpredictable forces of nature. If a swarm of locusts destroyed your crops, you couldn't fight them with swords, but you could put them on trial, formally banish them, and feel like you'd done something. The trials also reinforced the church's worldview. Medieval theology held that all creatures were part of God's creation and subject to his laws. If animals could be blessed and protected by the church, they could also be judged and punished. The trials demonstrated that divine law extended to every living thing, that nothing was outside God's jurisdiction. The practice of trying animals gradually died out in the 17th and 18th centuries as the Enlightenment brought new ideas about reason and justice. But the last recorded animal trial took place in 1864, when a dog was tried and executed in Switzerland for robbery and murder. These trials reveal something profound about the medieval mind. They lived in a world where the boundaries between human and animal, between natural and supernatural, were blurry and permeable. They believed that animals could sin, that insects could be reasoned with, that formal legal procedures could influence the behavior of creatures that couldn't understand language. It sounds absurd to us now, but to medieval people, it made perfect sense. And that's the secret. The medieval world operated on a completely different logic, a different set of assumptions about how reality worked. Understanding that logic is the key to understanding everything else about the Middle Ages. Here's a secret that will make you grateful for modern laundry detergent. In medieval Europe, urine was one of the most valuable commodities in the textile industry. It wasn't just used occasionally or as a last resort. It was the primary cleaning agent for cloth, and entire industries were built around collecting, storing, and selling human pee. The process was called fulling, and it was essential for making wool cloth wearable. Raw wool is greasy, full of lanolin and dirt and the natural oils that protect sheep from the elements. To turn this raw wool into soft, clean cloth, you had to remove all those oils. And the best way to do that was with urine. Urine contains ammonia, which is an excellent degreasing agent. Medieval fullers, the workers who processed cloth, would collect urine in large vats and let it age for several days. As it aged, the urea in the urine would break down into ammonia, creating a powerful cleaning solution. The cloth would be soaked in these vats of aged urine, then stomped on by workers who would spend hours treading the cloth with their bare feet, working the urine into every fiber. This was backbreaking, disgusting work, and fullers were among the lowest status workers in medieval society. They smelled terrible. Their feet were constantly soaked in urine, and they were often segregated to the outskirts of towns because no one wanted to live near a fullery. But urine was so valuable that cities had official urine collectors. In ancient Rome, there were public urinals where people could relieve themselves, and the urine would be collected and sold to fullers. This practice continued into the medieval period. In some cities, there were designated collection points where people could contribute their urine in exchange for a small payment. The urine trade was so lucrative that it was taxed. The Roman Emperor Vespasian famously imposed a tax on urine collection, and when his son complained about the disgusting nature of the tax, Vespasian held up a gold coin and said, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't smell. This phrase became a proverb used to justify any profitable but distasteful business. Medieval fullers didn't just use human urine. They also used urine from animals, particularly horses and cattle. Animal urine was considered even more potent than human urine, and fullers would pay farmers for access to their animals' waste. The fulling process didn't stop with urine. After the cloth had been thoroughly soaked and stomped, it would be rinsed in clean water, then stretched on frames called tenters to dry. The phrase "on tenterhooks" comes from this process, referring to the hooks that held the cloth taut on the frames. If you were on tenterhooks, you were in a state of tension, stretched tight like cloth on a tenter. Fulling was so important to the medieval economy that fullers formed powerful guilds, organizations that controlled who could practice the trade and set standards for quality. These guilds had their own patron saints, their own feast days, and their own elaborate rituals. Being a fuller might have been disgusting work, but it was also essential work, and fullers took pride in their craft. The use of urine in textile production continued well into the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't until the 19th century, when chemical processes were developed to produce synthetic ammonia, that urine finally became obsolete as a cleaning agent. But the legacy of urine in the textile industry lives on in unexpected ways. The word piss comes from the Latin word for urine, and it was originally a neutral, technical term used by fullers. Over time, it became vulgar, but its origins are in the respectable trade of cloth making. This secret reveals something important about medieval life. Nothing was wasted. Every substance, no matter how disgusting, had a use. Medieval people lived in a world of scarcity, where resources were precious and nothing could be thrown away. Urine wasn't waste. It was a valuable commodity, as important to the economy as wool or grain. Here's a secret that will make you question everything about modern work culture. Medieval peasants had more vacation time than you do. Yes, the people we think of as oppressed serfs, toiling endlessly in the fields, actually worked fewer days per year than the average modern worker. The medieval calendar was structured around the church, and the church loved holidays. There were Sundays, of course, when no work was allowed. That's 52 days right there. But there were also feast days, saints' days, and holy days scattered throughout the year. Depending on the region and the century, there could be anywhere from 60 to 100 of these holidays. Add it all up, and medieval peasants had somewhere between 150 and 200 days off per year. That's more than half the year. Compare that to the modern American worker, who gets an average of 10 to 15 days of vacation per year, and you start to see the problem. But wait, you might say. Weren't medieval peasants working from dawn to dusk when they did work? Weren't their lives brutal and exhausting? Yes and no. During planting and harvest seasons, peasants worked long, hard days. But these intense periods were relatively short, maybe a few weeks in spring and a few weeks in autumn. The rest of the year, the pace was much more relaxed. In winter, there was little field work to be done, and peasants spent their time on maintenance tasks, crafts, and simply surviving the cold. Even during the busy seasons, the workday was structured differently than modern work. Peasants would start early, work for a few hours, then break for a meal and rest during the hottest part of the day. They'd resume work in the late afternoon and finish before dark. There were no electric lights, so once the sun set, work stopped. The holidays weren't just days off. They were festivals, celebrations, times when the entire community came together for feasting, drinking, dancing, and games. These festivals were the highlight of the medieval year, the moments when the grinding poverty and hard work were temporarily forgotten in a burst of communal joy. The church encouraged these celebrations because they reinforced social bonds and gave people a release valve for their frustrations. A population that had regular festivals was less likely to revolt, less likely to question the social order. The holidays were a form of social control, but they were also genuinely enjoyed by the people who participated in them. This system started to break down in the late medieval period and the early modern period. As capitalism developed, as merchants and early industrialists gained power, they began to see these holidays as wasteful. Time off was time not spent producing goods, not generating profit. Gradually, the number of holidays was reduced and the work year expanded. By the 19th century, during the height of the Industrial Revolution, Workers were laboring 6 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, with only a handful of holidays per year. The medieval peasant's leisurely schedule was replaced by the brutal grind of factory work. It wasn't until the labor movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that workers began to win back some of their lost time off. The weekend, the 8-hour workday, paid vacation. These were all hard-fought victories, attempts to reclaim some of the leisure time that medieval peasants had taken for granted. This secret challenges our assumptions about progress. We think of the medieval period as a time of oppression and hardship, and the modern era as a time of freedom and prosperity. But in terms of work-life balance, medieval peasants had it better than we do. They had more time for rest, for family, for community, for simply being human. The question we should be asking is, how did we lose that? How did we create a society where working 50 weeks a year is considered normal, where taking a vacation is seen as a luxury rather than a necessity? The medieval peasants, for all their poverty and hardship, understood something we've forgotten. Life is more than work. Walk into a medieval town with a toothache, and you wouldn't look for a dentist. You'd look for a barber. The same person who cut your hair would also pull your teeth, let your blood, amputate your limbs, and perform surgery. This wasn't because medieval people were confused about professional boundaries. It was because barbers were the closest thing most people had to medical care. The connection between barbers and surgery goes back to the church. In 1130, the Council of Clermont forbade monks and priests from performing surgery or shedding blood. This was a problem because monasteries had been the primary source of medical care in medieval Europe. Monks were educated, they had access to medical texts, and they had the time and resources to care for the sick. But with the church's ban on bloodletting, someone else had to step in. That someone was the barber. Barbers already had the tools, sharp blades, steady hands, and a willingness to work with the human body. They were used to cutting hair and shaving beards, so cutting into flesh wasn't that much of a stretch. Barber-surgeons, as they came to be known, performed a wide range of medical procedures. Bloodletting was the most common. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors, and bloodletting was the primary treatment. If you had a fever, the barber would cut open a vein and drain some blood. If you had a headache, more bloodletting. If you had a cough, you guessed it, bloodletting. The procedure was simple, but dangerous. The barber would tie a tourniquet around your arm to make the veins bulge, then make a cut with a sharp blade called a phlegm. Blood would pour into a bowl, and the barber would judge when enough had been removed based on the color and consistency of the blood. There was no understanding of blood volume or the dangers of excessive blood loss. Many patients died from bloodletting, either from shock or from infections that developed afterward. Barber-surgeons also pulled teeth. Dental care in the Middle Ages was primitive and painful. If you had a rotten tooth, the only solution was extraction. The barber would use iron pliers to grip the tooth and yank it out, often breaking it in the process. There was no anesthesia, so patients would be held down by assistants while they screamed in agony. Amputations were another specialty. If you had a gangrenous limb, the barber would saw it off. The procedure was quick and brutal. The limb would be tied off with a tourniquet, then sawed through with a bone saw. The stump would be cauterized with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. The survival rate was low, but it was better than letting the gangrene spread. Barber-surgeons also treated wounds, set broken bones, and lanced boils. They were the emergency room doctors of the medieval world, dealing with the immediate, visible problems that people brought to them. They had no understanding of infection or bacteria, but they developed practical techniques through trial and error. The iconic barber pole, with its red and white stripes, comes from this history. The red represents blood, the white represents bandages, and the pole itself represents the staff that patients would grip during bloodletting. Some barber poles also have a blue stripe, which represents veins. Every time you see a barber pole, you're looking at a symbol of medieval surgery. The split between barbers and surgeons didn't happen until the 18th century, when medicine became more professionalized and surgeons began to see themselves as distinct from barbers. But for most of the medieval period and well into the early modern period, If you needed medical care, you went to your barber. This secret reveals the pragmatic, improvisational nature of medieval life. People made do with what they had. If the church wouldn't provide medical care, they'd find someone else who would. If that someone was the local barber, so be it. The medieval world was full of these hybrid professions. People who wore multiple hats because specialization was a luxury that most communities couldn't afford. Here's something that will change how you think about sleep. Medieval people didn't sleep through the night the way we do. They slept in two distinct shifts with a period of wakefulness in between. This wasn't insomnia or a sleep disorder. It was the normal, natural sleep pattern for most of human history. The pattern was called biphasic sleep, or segmented sleep. People would go to bed shortly after dark, around 8 or 9 in the evening. They'd sleep for 3 to 4 hours, then wake up naturally around midnight. This period of wakefulness would last for an hour or two, and then they'd go back to sleep for another 3 to 4 hours, waking at dawn. What did people do during this midnight waking period? All sorts of things. They'd pray, meditate, or reflect on their dreams. They'd have sex. In fact, some medieval doctors recommended this time for conception, believing that couples were more relaxed and receptive. They'd visit neighbors, chat with family members, or do light chores like tending the fire or checking on animals. This pattern is documented throughout medieval literature. References to first sleep and second sleep appear in everything from legal depositions to novels to medical texts. People would say things like, "I woke after my first sleep," or "Between sleeps I heard a noise." It was so common that it didn't need explanation. Everyone knew what it meant. The biphasic sleep pattern wasn't unique to medieval Europe. It appears in cultures around the world, from Africa to Asia to the Americas. It seems to be the natural human sleep pattern, the way our bodies want to sleep when not constrained by artificial lighting and rigid schedules. The shift to consolidated sleep, sleeping through the night in one long block, happened gradually during the Industrial Revolution. As artificial lighting became more common and more affordable, people stayed up later. As factories demanded workers show up at specific times, sleep schedules became more rigid. The flexible, natural rhythm of biphasic sleep was replaced by the tyranny of the alarm clock. By the early 20th century, biphasic sleep had been almost completely forgotten in the Western world. Doctors began treating nighttime wakefulness as a disorder, prescribing sleeping pills and other interventions to help people sleep through the night. The natural pattern that humans had followed for thousands of years was pathologized, turned into a medical problem that needed to be fixed. But here's the thing. Many people still experience biphasic sleep, especially in winter when nights are long. They wake up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep, and they worry that something is wrong with them. But nothing is wrong. Their bodies are simply following the ancient pattern, the rhythm that medieval people knew and accepted. Some sleep researchers argue that we should embrace biphasic sleep, that fighting against it causes more problems than it solves. They point out that the period of wakefulness between sleeps can be peaceful and productive, a time for quiet reflection in a world that's increasingly noisy and demanding. Medieval people didn't have sleep anxiety. They didn't lie awake worrying about not sleeping. They accepted that sleep came in 2 shifts, and they used the time between sleeps for rest, reflection, and connection. They didn't see nighttime wakefulness as a problem to be solved. They saw it as a natural part of the rhythm of life. This secret challenges our assumptions about what's normal and natural. We think of sleeping through the night as the healthy, proper way to sleep. But that's a modern invention, a product of artificial lighting and industrial schedules. The medieval way, sleeping in 2 shifts, waking naturally in the middle of the night, might actually be healthier and more in tune with our biology. The next time you wake up at 2 in the morning and can't get back to sleep, don't panic. Don't reach for the sleeping pills. Just remember, you're experiencing what medieval people experienced every night. You're following a pattern that's thousands of years old. And maybe, just maybe, your body knows something that modern medicine has forgotten. Here's a myth that needs to die. Knights in full plate armor were so weighed down that they couldn't move, couldn't get up if they fell, and had to be lifted onto their horses with cranes. This image has been perpetuated by movies, books, and even some history teachers. But it's completely false. A full suit of plate armor, the kind worn by knights in the 15th century, weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. That's heavy, yes, but it's not immobilizing. Modern soldiers routinely carry more weight than that in gear and equipment. The key difference is how the weight is distributed. Plate armor was custom-made for each knight, fitted precisely to his body. The weight was distributed across the entire frame: shoulders, chest, back, hips, legs. No single part of the body bore too much weight. A well-fitted suit of armor was surprisingly comfortable and allowed for a full range of motion. Knights could run, jump, climb, and even do acrobatics in their armor. There are documented accounts of knights performing cartwheels and somersaults to demonstrate their agility. They could mount their horses without assistance, using the stirrup like anyone else. The idea that they needed cranes is absurd and has no basis in historical fact. The armor was also designed with mobility in mind. The joints, shoulders, elbows, knees, hips were articulated, made of overlapping plates that moved smoothly as the knight moved. The armor didn't restrict movement. It protected while allowing the knight to fight effectively. Fighting in armor required training and conditioning, of course. Knights trained from childhood, building the strength and endurance needed to wear armor for hours at a time. By the time they were adults, wearing armor was second nature. It was like a second skin, protective and familiar. The myth of immobile knights probably comes from a few sources. First, there were ceremonial suits of armor, made for display rather than combat. These were often heavier and more ornate, designed to impress rather than to be practical. They were never meant to be worn in battle, but people who saw them in museums assumed they were typical. Second, there were some extremely heavy suits of armor made for specific purposes, like jousting. Jousting armor was reinforced on the left side, the side that faced the opponent's lance, and could weigh up to 90 pounds. But even this armor allowed for movement, and it was only worn for the brief duration of the joust. Third, there's the fact that knights who fell off their horses in battle were vulnerable, not because they couldn't get up, but because they were surrounded by enemies trying to kill them. A knight on the ground was at a disadvantage, not because of the armor's weight, but because he'd lost his primary weapon, the horse, and was now fighting on foot against multiple opponents. The reality is that plate armor was a marvel of medieval engineering. It provided excellent protection against swords, arrows, and other weapons while allowing the knight to move freely. It was expensive, requiring skilled armorers and high-quality steel, but for those who could afford it, it was worth every penny. Knights in armor were formidable opponents. They were trained warriors, physically fit, skilled in combat, and protected by the best defensive technology of their time. They weren't clumsy or helpless. They were the medieval equivalent of tanks, mobile and deadly. This secret matters because it corrects a fundamental misunderstanding about medieval warfare. Knights weren't lumbering, vulnerable targets. They were elite soldiers, and their armor was a key part of what made them effective. Understanding this changes how we think about medieval battles, about the tactics and strategies that were used, about why knights dominated European warfare for centuries. The next time you see a movie where a knight falls down and can't get up, remember, that's Hollywood, not history. Real knights were athletes, warriors who could fight for hours in armor that protected them without slowing them down. They were the special forces of the medieval world, and their armor was their greatest asset. Castles look romantic in movies and fairy tales, with their soaring towers and grand halls. But the reality of living in a medieval castle was far less appealing. Castles were cold, dark, drafty, and deeply uncomfortable places to live. They were fortresses first and homes second, designed for defense rather than comfort. Let's start with the cold. Stone walls, which were necessary for defense, are terrible insulators. In winter, castles became ice boxes. The only source of heat was fireplaces, and even the largest fireplace could only warm a small area. If you were sitting right next to the fire, you might be comfortable. If you were anywhere else in the room, you were freezing. Most castles had only 1 or 2 heated rooms, usually the Great Hall and perhaps the Lord's private chamber. Everyone else, including servants and soldiers, had to make do with unheated spaces. People slept in their clothes, piled under every blanket and fur they owned, and still woke up shivering. The windows made things worse. Glass was expensive and rare, so most windows were just openings in the wall covered with wooden shutters. In winter, you had a choice. Keep the shutters open and freeze, or close them and sit in darkness. Most people chose darkness, which brings us to the next problem. Castles were dark. Very dark. During the day, with the shutters closed, the only light came from candles and oil lamps. These were expensive, so they were used sparingly. Most people navigated the castle by feel, memorizing the layout so they could move through the darkness without tripping. At night, the darkness was absolute. There were no street lights, no electric lights, nothing. If you needed to move through the castle at night, you carried a candle or a torch, and you prayed you didn't drop it and start a fire. The smell was another issue. Castles had primitive sanitation. Toilets, called garderobes, were basically holes in the wall that dropped waste down the outside of the castle or into a moat. The smell from these toilets permeated the castle, especially in summer. People tried to mask it with herbs and perfumes, but it was always there, a constant reminder of the lack of proper plumbing. The great hall, where the lord and his household ate and socialized, was often filled with smoke. The fireplace was supposed to vent smoke up the chimney, but medieval chimneys were inefficient, and smoke would billow back into the room. People's eyes would water, their throats would burn, and their clothes would reek of smoke. Privacy was almost non-existent. The lord and lady might have a private chamber, but everyone else slept in communal spaces. Servants slept in the great hall, on benches or on the floor. Soldiers slept in the barracks or the guardhouse. Even noble guests might have to share a room with several other people. The food was often mediocre. Castles had kitchens, but they were separate buildings to reduce the risk of fire. This meant that food had to be carried from the kitchen to the great hall, and it would arrive lukewarm at best. In winter, it would be cold by the time it reached the table. Castles were also damp. Stone walls absorbed moisture, and there was no way to dry them out. Mold grew in corners, tapestries became mildewed, and everything felt slightly damp to the touch. This dampness contributed to respiratory problems, and many castle dwellers suffered from chronic coughs and lung infections. Despite all these discomforts, castles served their purpose. They were defensible, which was the most important thing in a violent age. The thick walls could withstand sieges, the high towers provided excellent views of approaching enemies, and the narrow windows made it difficult for attackers to shoot arrows inside. But living in a castle was a sacrifice. You traded comfort for security, warmth for safety. The lords and ladies who lived in these fortresses understood this trade-off. They accepted the cold, the dark, the smell, the discomfort, because the alternative, living in an undefended manor house, was too dangerous. This secret shatters the romantic image of castle life. There were no cozy evenings by the fire, no warm, well-lit rooms, no comfortable beds. There was only stone and cold and darkness, and the knowledge that these walls were the only thing standing between you and the violence of the medieval world. The stereotype of the filthy medieval peasant who never bathed is partially true, but it's more complicated than that. Bathing habits in the Middle Ages varied widely depending on social class, region, and time period. And contrary to popular belief, many medieval people, especially nobles, bathed regularly and took hygiene seriously. Let's start with the peasants. Yes, they bathed infrequently, but this wasn't because they didn't care about cleanliness. It was because bathing was difficult, time-consuming, and sometimes dangerous. Peasants lived in small huts with no running water. To bathe, they had to haul water from a well or stream, heat it over a fire, and fill a wooden tub. This process took hours and required a lot of fuel, which was expensive. In summer, peasants might bathe in streams or rivers, but in winter, this wasn't an option. So they made do with what they could. They washed their hands and faces daily, using cold water from a basin. They changed their undergarments regularly, or at least as regularly as they could afford, and they used herbs and perfumes to mask body odor. Nobles, on the other hand, bathed frequently. They had servants to haul and heat water, and they had the resources to make bathing a regular part of their routine. Bathing was seen as a luxury, a sign of refinement and civilization. Medieval bathhouses were common in cities and towns. These were public facilities where people could pay to bathe in large wooden tubs. The bathhouses were social spaces where people would gather to relax, gossip, and conduct business. Men and women often bathed together, which scandalized the church but was accepted by most people as normal. The bathhouses offered more than just bathing. They provided grooming services, haircuts, shaves, nail trimming. They offered food and drink. Some even offered sexual services, which is why the church was so opposed to them. By the late medieval period, many bathhouses had been shut down or heavily regulated due to concerns about immorality and the spread of disease. Medieval people also understood the connection between cleanliness and health, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. They knew that bathing made them feel better, that clean clothes were more comfortable than dirty ones, that washing wounds helped them heal. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that cleanliness mattered. The myth of the filthy medieval person comes largely from the early modern period, particularly the 16th and 17th centuries. During this time, medical theories changed, and doctors began to believe that bathing was dangerous. They thought that water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. This led to a decline in bathing, and people began to rely more heavily on perfumes and powders to mask body odor. By the 18th century, European aristocrats were famously filthy. They wore elaborate wigs to hide their unwashed hair. They doused themselves in perfume to cover the smell, and they avoided bathing for months at a time. This was a dramatic change from the medieval period when bathing was common and encouraged. The medieval attitude toward bathing was actually more enlightened than what came after. Medieval people understood that cleanliness was important, and they made efforts to stay clean within the constraints of their technology and resources. By the 18th century, European aristocrats were famously filthy. They wore elaborate wigs to hide their unwashed hair. They doused themselves in perfume to cover the smell, and they avoided bathing for months at a time. This was a dramatic change from the medieval period, when bathing was common and encouraged. The medieval attitude toward bathing was actually more enlightened than what came after. Medieval people understood that cleanliness was important, and they made efforts to stay clean within the constraints of their technology and resources. This secret challenges the stereotype of the dirty, ignorant medieval peasant. Yes, peasants bathed less frequently than we do today, but they weren't wallowing in filth. They did what they could with what they had, and nobles who had more resources bathed regularly and took pride in their cleanliness. The decline in bathing that happened after the medieval period is a reminder that progress isn't linear. Sometimes societies move backward. Sometimes new ideas are worse than old ones. The medieval bathhouse, with its communal tubs and social atmosphere, was in many ways superior to the perfume-soaked, unwashed aristocrats of the 17th century. Medieval dining was nothing like what we're used to today. Forget plates, forks, and napkins. At a medieval feast, your plate was a thick slice of stale bread called a trencher. This wasn't fresh, soft bread. It was old, hard bread, sometimes several days old, cut into thick slabs that could hold food without falling apart. The trencher served as both plate and utensil. You'd pile your food on top of it, meat, vegetables, sauce, and eat with your hands or a knife. The bread would soak up the juices and sauces, becoming softer and more flavorful as the meal progressed. At the end of the meal, you could eat the trencher itself, now saturated with all the flavors of your dinner. But here's the interesting part. Most people didn't eat their trenchers. Instead, they were collected and given to the poor. This was considered an act of charity, a way for the wealthy to share their abundance. The trenchers, soaked with meat juices and sauces, were actually quite nutritious and were eagerly sought by beggars and the destitute. Some nobles would have servants collect the trenchers and distribute them at the castle gates, where the poor would gather. This practice was so common that it became institutionalized, with specific rules about how trenchers should be distributed and who was entitled to receive them. The use of trenchers reveals something important about medieval attitudes toward waste and charity. Nothing was thrown away. Even the bread that had served as a plate was valuable, worth saving and giving to those who needed it. The medieval world operated on principles of reuse and redistribution that we've largely lost in our disposable culture. Trenchers began to fall out of use in the late medieval period as wooden and metal plates became more common and affordable. but the practice persisted in some regions well into the 16th century, a reminder of a time when even the plate you ate from had a second life. One of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages is that people married very young, with girls becoming brides at 12 or 13. While this did happen among the nobility, where marriages were political alliances, it was not the norm for ordinary people. For peasants and townspeople, the average age of first marriage was surprisingly high. Women typically married in their early to mid-20s, men in their late 20s or early 30s. This was because marriage required economic independence. A couple needed to establish a household, which meant having land, tools, and resources. Young people had to work and save for years before they could afford to marry. The church set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but these were minimums, not norms. Most people married much later. Parish records from across medieval Europe consistently show that the average age of first marriage was in the 20s. This late marriage age had important demographic consequences. It meant that women had fewer childbearing years within marriage, which helped keep population growth in check. It also meant that young people had a period of relative freedom before marriage, a time when they could work, save money, and make their own choices. The myth of child marriage comes from the nobility, where marriages were arranged for political reasons. A noble girl might be betrothed at a young age, but the marriage wouldn't be consummated until she was older. These political marriages were the exception, not the rule. Understanding the real marriage patterns of medieval people changes how we think about their society. They weren't rushing into marriage as children. They were waiting, planning, building the economic foundation necessary for a successful household. In some ways, their approach to marriage was more mature and practical than our modern romantic ideal. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population, people desperately searched for explanations and solutions. One of the most tragic responses was the mass killing of cats. Medieval people believed that the plague was caused by bad air, by the wrath of God, or by the malign influence of certain animals. Cats, with their nocturnal habits and association with witchcraft, were seen as suspicious. Some people believed that cats were spreading the disease or that they were agents of the devil sent to punish humanity. The result was a widespread campaign to kill cats. They were hunted, trapped, and slaughtered by the thousands. In some cities, cat killing became a public spectacle, with organized hunts and mass burnings. This was a catastrophic mistake. Cats were actually one of the best defenses against the plague, because they killed rats. The plague was spread by fleas that lived on rats, and by eliminating cats, people allowed the rat population to explode. This made the plague worse, not better. The irony is almost unbearable. In their panic and ignorance, medieval people killed the very animals that could have helped them. They made the plague deadlier through their own actions, driven by superstition and fear. The cat population in Europe didn't recover for centuries. Even after the plague ended, cats remained associated with witchcraft and evil. During the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, cats were often killed alongside their owners, accused of being familiars or demonic companions. It wasn't until the 18th century that cats began to be rehabilitated in European culture, valued once again for their ability to control rodents. But the damage had been done. The mass killing of cats during the Black Death remains one of the most tragic examples of how ignorance and superstition can lead to disastrous consequences. Here's a myth that refuses to die. Medieval people thought the earth was flat, and Christopher Columbus proved them wrong when he sailed to America. This is completely false. Medieval scholars knew the earth was round, and they had known it for over 1,000 years. The ancient Greeks had figured out that the earth was spherical. Aristotle provided evidence for a round earth in the 4th century BCE, and Eratosthenes calculated the earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century BCE. This knowledge was never lost. Medieval scholars read the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors, and they accepted the spherical earth as established fact. Every educated person in medieval Europe knew the earth was round. It was taught in universities, discussed in scholarly texts, and accepted by the church. The myth of the flat earth was invented in the 19th century. largely by writers who wanted to portray the medieval period as a time of ignorance and superstition. They created a false narrative where Columbus was a brave visionary fighting against ignorant churchmen who believed in a flat earth. The truth is that no one disputed that the earth was round. The debate about Columbus's voyage was about the size of the earth, not its shape. Columbus believed the earth was smaller than it actually is, which is why he thought he could reach Asia by sailing west. The scholars who opposed his voyage were actually correct. They knew the earth was too large for his plan to work. Columbus got lucky and ran into the Americas instead. Medieval maps show a round earth. Medieval globes, yes, they had globes, depicted a spherical world. Medieval art often showed Christ or God holding a spherical earth. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. This secret matters because it corrects a fundamental misunderstanding about medieval intellectual life. Medieval scholars weren't ignorant. They were highly educated, well-read, and engaged with the scientific knowledge of their time. They made important contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. The flat earth myth is a slander against medieval people, a way of making them seem primitive and foolish. But they weren't. They were our intellectual ancestors, and they knew far more than we give them credit for. Trial by ordeal took many forms, and one of the strangest was trial by corsned, also known as trial by cake. This was used primarily in England and involved the accused eating a piece of bread or cake while a priest said prayers. If the person could swallow the food without choking, they were innocent. If they choked, they were guilty. The logic behind this trial was that God would cause the guilty to choke, physically preventing them from swallowing the consecrated food. The innocent, protected by divine grace, would be able to eat without difficulty. In practice, trial by corsned was a psychological test. The accused, terrified and under enormous stress, would often have difficulty swallowing due to a dry mouth and constricted throat. This physical response to fear was interpreted as a sign of guilt. The most famous case of trial by corsned involved Godwin, Earl of Wessex, in the 11th century. According to legend, Godwin was accused of murdering the king's brother. He swore his innocence and called upon God to choke him if he was lying. He then took a piece of bread, ate it, and immediately choked to death. Whether this story is true or embellished, it shows how seriously people took trial by corsned. They believed that God would intervene, that the act of eating could become a divine judgment. Trial by corsned was less physically brutal than other forms of trial by ordeal, but it was no less terrifying. The psychological pressure was immense, and the consequences of failure were severe. A person who choked during the trial would be declared guilty and punished accordingly, often with execution. This form of trial gradually fell out of use along with other ordeals, but it persisted in some regions longer than others. The last recorded trial by corsned took place in the 13th century, though informal children drank small beer from a young age. It was considered healthier than water and more nutritious than many other beverages. The grains used in brewing provided calories and some vitamins, making beer a dietary staple. Brewing was typically done by women, and it was one of the few trades where women could earn money independently. Alewives, as female brewers were called, would brew beer in their homes and sell it to neighbors. They advertised their product by hanging a pole or bush outside their door, a practice that eventually evolved into the pub sign. The church had mixed feelings about beer. On one hand, it was a necessity, and monks were some of the most skilled brewers in medieval Europe. Monasteries produced beer for their own consumption and for sale, and some monastic beers were famous for their quality. On the other hand, the church worried about drunkenness and the social problems associated with taverns. Beer was so central to medieval life that it was used as currency. Workers were often paid partly in beer, and it was included in rations for soldiers and sailors. A day's work might earn you a loaf of bread and a gallon of beer. The dominance of beer began to decline in the early modern period as tea and coffee became available. These new beverages offered a safe alternative to water without the alcohol content of beer. But for most of the medieval period, beer was the drink of choice. The beverage that kept people hydrated and relatively healthy in a world where clean water was a luxury. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture a drab, colorless world of gray stone and brown wool. This image is completely wrong. Medieval people loved bright, vivid colors, and they wore them whenever they could afford to. The problem is that most medieval textiles haven't survived, and those that have faded over centuries. The vibrant reds, blues, and greens that medieval people wore have turned to muted browns and grays. When we see medieval artifacts in museums, we're seeing them after hundreds of years of decay, not as they originally appeared. Medieval clothing was often brilliantly colored. The wealthy wore scarlet, a bright red dye made from insects. They wore blues made from woad or the more expensive indigo. They wore greens, yellows, and purples, each color signaling wealth and status. Even peasants wore colored clothing when they could. They might not afford scarlet or indigo, but they could dye their clothes with local plants, creating yellows, browns, and muted greens. A peasant's Sunday best might be a tunic dyed with madder root, giving it a reddish hue. Medieval buildings were also colorful. Churches were painted inside and out with bright frescoes covering the walls and ceilings. Statues were painted in realistic colors with rosy cheeks, red lips, and gilded details. The white marble statues we see today were originally painted, and they would have looked garish to modern eyes. Even castles were more colorful than we imagine. The stone walls might be gray, but they were often covered with tapestries, painted cloths, and banners. The great hall would be a riot of color, with heraldic shields hanging from the walls and brightly colored cushions on the benches. The medieval love of color extended to manuscripts. Illuminated manuscripts were works of art, with pages decorated in gold leaf, bright blues, and vivid reds. The colors were made from expensive pigments, lapis lazuli for blue, gold leaf for gold, cochineal for red. These manuscripts were treasured possessions, valued as much for their beauty as for their content. The reason we think of the Middle Ages as drab is partly due to Hollywood. Medieval movies often use a muted color palette to create a sense of historical authenticity. But this is based on a misunderstanding. The real Middle Ages was much more colorful than the movies suggest. Understanding the medieval love of color changes how we think about the period. It wasn't a dark age of ignorance and gloom. It was a time when people celebrated beauty, when they used color to express joy, status, and creativity. The medieval world was vibrant, alive, and full of visual splendor. In medieval libraries, books were so valuable that they were literally chained to the desks. This wasn't paranoia. It was a practical response to the enormous cost of books in an age before printing. A single book could take months or even years to produce. A scribe would copy the text by hand, letter by letter, on parchment made from animal skins. An illuminator would add decorations and illustrations. A binder would sew the pages together and attach them to wooden boards covered in leather. The result was a work of art, but also an object of immense value. A large Bible might cost as much as a farm. A university textbook might represent a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Books were investments, heirlooms, treasures, and they were tempting targets for thieves. To protect their collections, libraries chained books to the desks or shelves. The chain was attached to the book's binding and to a rod that ran along the shelf. The chain was long enough to allow the book to be taken down and read, but not long enough to be carried away. These chained libraries still exist in a few places. The most famous is the Hereford Cathedral Library in England, where books have been chained to desks since the 17th century. Walking through a chained library is an eerie experience. The books sit in rows, each one tethered like a prisoner, a reminder of a time when knowledge was so precious it had to be physically restrained. The practice of chaining books began to decline with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. As books became cheaper and more plentiful, the need to chain them diminished. But in some libraries, particularly in monasteries and cathedrals, books remained chained well into the 18th century. The chained library is a powerful symbol of medieval attitudes toward knowledge. Books were not disposable objects to be read and discarded. They were treasures, carefully preserved and protected. The chain was a sign of value, a recognition that what was written on those pages was worth more than gold. Despite what movies might suggest, most medieval people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. The average peasant lived their entire life within a radius of about 10 to 20 miles. They were born in a village, worked in the fields around that village, married someone from the same village or a neighboring one, and died without ever seeing a city or the sea. Travel was difficult, dangerous, and expensive. Roads were poor, little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in rain. There were no maps for ordinary people, no road signs, no reliable way to navigate. Bandits were a constant threat, and travelers had no protection except what they could provide for themselves. Most people had no reason to travel. Their lives were tied to the land they worked. Leaving meant abandoning their livelihood, their community, their entire world. And where would they go? Other villages were much like their own. Cities were dangerous, expensive, and unwelcoming to outsiders. The few people who did travel were merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and nobles. Merchants traveled to trade goods, following established routes and staying in known inns. Pilgrims traveled to holy sites, seeking spiritual merit and adventure. Soldiers traveled because they were ordered to, marching to war and hoping to return home. Nobles traveled to visit their estates, to attend court, or to participate in tournaments. For these travelers, the journey was an ordeal. They might walk 20 miles a day if they were on foot, or 30 to 40 miles if they had a horse. They would stay in inns or monasteries, paying for food and shelter. They would be constantly alert for danger, watching for bandits, wild animals, and hostile locals. The lack of travel had profound effects on medieval society. It meant that most people had a very limited worldview. They knew their village intimately, but they knew almost nothing about the wider world. News traveled slowly, carried by merchants and wandering friars. Events that happened 100 miles away might not be known for weeks or months. This isolation also meant that regional differences were pronounced. Each area had its own dialect, its own customs, its own way of doing things. A person from northern England might have difficulty understanding someone from southern England, even though they spoke the same language. The medieval world was a patchwork of small, isolated communities, each one a world unto itself. The idea of a unified nation, of a shared national identity, was still centuries away. People identified with their village, their lord, their region, not with England or France or Germany. Understanding this isolation is key to understanding medieval life. It was a world of small horizons, where the familiar was everything, and the unknown was terrifying. Medieval people were significantly shorter than modern people, but not for the reasons you might think. It wasn't genetics, it was nutrition. The average height for a medieval man was about 5 feet 6 inches. For women, it was about 5 feet 2 inches. Compare this to modern averages: 5 feet 9 inches for men, 5 feet 4 inches for women. And you can see the difference. This height difference was entirely due to diet. Medieval people, especially peasants, didn't get enough protein, vitamins, or calories during their growing years. Their diet was heavy on bread and grains, light on meat, dairy, and fresh vegetables. This chronic malnutrition stunted growth. Children were particularly affected. They needed more calories and nutrients than adults to support their growth, but they often received less. In times of famine, children were fed last, after the adults who did the work. This meant that many children grew up undernourished, never reaching their full genetic potential for height. The nobility were taller than peasants, sometimes by several inches. This wasn't because they had different genes, it was because they ate better. Nobles had access to meat, fish, cheese, and other protein-rich foods. They ate more calories overall, and they ate a more varied diet. This better nutrition allowed them to grow taller. Height was actually a visible marker of social class. You could often tell a noble from a peasant just by looking at them. The noble would be taller, healthier looking, with better teeth and clearer skin. The peasant would be shorter, more worn, with the physical marks of a hard life. Interestingly, medieval people were taller than people in the early industrial period. During the 18th and 19th centuries, as people moved to cities and worked in factories, average height actually decreased. Urban living conditions were so bad, with overcrowding, pollution, and poor nutrition, that people became shorter and less healthy. It wasn't until the 20th century, with improvements in nutrition and public health, that average height began to increase again. Today, we're taller than medieval people, but we're also taller than our own great-grandparents. Height is a useful measure of overall health and living standards. The fact that medieval people were short tells us that life was hard, that food was scarce, that children grew up hungry. But it also tells us that height is not fixed. It's responsive to environment and nutrition. Given the right conditions, humans can grow taller, healthier, and stronger. Medieval people weren't all work and prayer. They loved games, sports, and gambling, often to the point where authorities tried to ban these activities. Dice games were enormously popular, played in taverns, on street corners, and even in churches. People would bet money, clothes, tools, anything of value on the roll of the dice. The church condemned gambling as a sin, but this did little to stop it. Even priests and monks were known to gamble, despite the risk of punishment. Loaded dice were common, and accusations of cheating often led to fights. Board games were also popular. Chess had been introduced to Europe from the Islamic world and quickly became a favorite among the nobility. It was seen as a game of strategy and intelligence, suitable for educated people. Backgammon, or tables as it was called, was another popular board game, played by people of all social classes. Outdoor games and sports were common, especially among young men. Football, a chaotic and violent game with few rules, was played in villages and towns. Matches could involve entire villages, with hundreds of players and goals that were miles apart. The game often resulted in injuries and property damage, leading to repeated attempts by authorities to ban it. Archery was both a sport and a legal requirement. English law mandated that all able-bodied men practice archery regularly to ensure a ready supply of skilled archers for the army. Archery competitions were held on Sundays and holidays, with prizes for the best shots. Jousting and tournaments were the sports of the nobility. These were elaborate, expensive events where knights would compete in mounted combat, trying to knock each other off their horses with lances. Tournaments were dangerous, and deaths were not uncommon, but they were also thrilling spectacles that drew large crowds. Medieval people also enjoyed blood sports. Bear baiting, where dogs would attack a chained bear, was popular entertainment. Cockfighting, where roosters fought to the death, was another common pastime. These sports seem cruel to modern sensibilities, but medieval people saw them as exciting and acceptable forms of entertainment. The love of games and gambling reveals a side of medieval life that's often overlooked. These weren't grim, joyless people. They sought pleasure, excitement, and social connection through play. They took risks, celebrated victories, and mourned losses, just like people in any era. While medieval medicine had its share of bizarre and ineffective treatments, it also used remedies that actually worked. Medieval physicians and herbalists had a sophisticated understanding of medicinal plants, and many of their treatments have been validated by modern science. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, was used to treat pain and fever. This is the same active ingredient found in aspirin. Medieval people didn't know about salicylic acid, but they knew from experience that willow bark worked. Honey was used to treat wounds and prevent infection. Modern research has confirmed that honey has antibacterial properties and can promote healing. Medieval physicians were right to use it, even if they didn't understand why it worked. Garlic was used to treat infections and digestive problems. We now know that garlic has antimicrobial properties and can help fight certain types of bacteria. Foxglove, a plant that contains digitalis, was used to treat heart problems. Digitalis is still used in modern medicine to treat heart failure and irregular heartbeat. Medieval herbalists discovered this use through careful observation and experimentation. Opium, derived from poppies, was used as a painkiller and sedative. While medieval physicians didn't understand addiction or proper dosing, they recognized opium's powerful effects and used it to ease suffering. Medieval medicine also included surgical techniques that were surprisingly advanced. Surgeons could set broken bones, amputate limbs, remove bladder stones, and even perform cataract surgery. These procedures were dangerous and often fatal, but they were sometimes successful. The problem with medieval medicine wasn't that it was entirely wrong. It was that it was mixed with ineffective and harmful practices. For every treatment that worked, there were a dozen that didn't. Bloodletting, for example, was used for almost every ailment. despite being harmful in most cases. Medieval physicians also lacked an understanding of infection and disease transmission. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses, so they couldn't prevent or treat infections effectively. This meant that even successful surgeries often ended in death from infection. But we shouldn't dismiss medieval medicine entirely. It was a mixture of effective folk remedies, careful observation, and trial and error. Medieval physicians were working with limited knowledge and tools, but they were trying to help their patients, and sometimes they succeeded. Medieval people lived in a world populated by supernatural beings. Fairies, elves, goblins, and spirits were not just stories. They were real, dangerous entities that could affect your life in profound ways. Fairies were particularly feared. They were thought to steal children, replacing them with changelings. Fairy children left in place of the stolen human babies. Parents would go to great lengths to protect their infants from fairy abduction, using iron, which fairies supposedly couldn't touch, and various charms and rituals. Elves were believed to cause illness, particularly mysterious ailments that had no obvious cause. If you woke up with unexplained pain or sickness, you might have been elf-shot, struck by an invisible arrow fired by elves. There were specific prayers and remedies to cure elf-shot, involving herbs, charms, and Christian prayers. The boundary between the Christian supernatural, angels, demons, saints, and the pagan supernatural, fairies, elves, spirits, was blurry. The church tried to suppress belief in pagan entities, but these beliefs were deeply rooted in folk culture and persisted throughout the medieval period. People left offerings for fairies and spirits, hoping to gain their favor or at least avoid their wrath. They avoided certain places, fairy rings, ancient burial mounds, crossroads, where supernatural beings were thought to gather. These beliefs weren't just rural superstitions. Even educated people, including clergy, believed in the reality of supernatural beings. The difference was that educated people tried to fit these beings into a Christian framework, explaining them as demons or fallen angels rather than as independent entities. The belief in fairies and elves reveals the medieval worldview. The world was not just physical. It was layered with invisible forces, populated by beings that could help or harm. Every illness, every misfortune, every stroke of luck had a supernatural explanation. This worldview persisted long after the medieval period. Belief in fairies was common in rural areas well into the 19th century, and in some places it never entirely disappeared. Medieval Christianity was centered on relics, physical objects associated with saints or with Christ himself. These relics were believed to have miraculous powers, and they were among the most valuable objects in medieval Europe. A relic could be anything: a bone from a saint's body, a piece of cloth that touched a holy person, a splinter from the true cross, a thorn from Christ's crown. The more important the saint, the more powerful the relic. Churches competed to acquire relics, which brought prestige and pilgrims. A church with a famous relic could attract thousands of visitors, all bringing donations. Relics were bought, sold, stolen, and even faked. The trade in relics was a major industry. Some relics were clearly fraudulent. There were enough splinters of the true cross in circulation to build several crosses. Multiple churches claimed to have the head of John the Baptist. The foreskin of Christ was displayed in at least 8 different locations. But medieval people believed in these relics with absolute conviction. They would travel hundreds of miles to see a famous relic, hoping for healing, forgiveness, or spiritual merit. They would touch the reliquary, pray before it, and leave offerings. Relics were also used in oaths and legal proceedings. Swearing an oath on a relic was considered more binding than any other form of oath. Breaking such an oath would bring not just legal consequences, but divine punishment. The obsession with relics reveals the medieval desire for tangible connection to the divine. The spiritual world wasn't abstract or distant. It was present in physical objects that could be seen, touched, and venerated. Relics made the sacred real and accessible. Medieval culture was full of riddles, wordplay, and intellectual games. Riddles appeared in literature, in everyday conversation, and even in religious contexts. They were a form of entertainment, education, and social bonding. The Anglo-Saxon Exeter book, compiled in the 10th century, contains nearly 100 riddles. These range from simple to complex, from innocent to bawdy. Some describe everyday objects, a plow, a book, a sword. Others are more abstract, describing concepts like time or death. Riddles were also used in education. Teachers would pose riddles to students to test their knowledge and sharpen their thinking. The ability to solve riddles was seen as a sign of intelligence and wit. In social settings, riddle contests were popular entertainment. People would challenge each other to solve increasingly difficult riddles, with the winner gaining prestige and sometimes prizes. Riddles also appeared in religious contexts. The Bible contains riddles, most famously Samson's riddle in the Book of Judges. Medieval preachers would use riddles in their sermons to engage their audiences and illustrate theological points. The love of riddles reflects the medieval appreciation for cleverness and wordplay. Language was a tool to be manipulated, enjoyed, and celebrated. Riddles were a way to demonstrate mastery of language and thought. In the 14th and 15th centuries, European fashion took a bizarre turn. Shoes with extremely long pointed toes called poulains or cracouis. These shoes were so long that the toes had to be stuffed with moss or wool to keep their shape. The length of the toe indicated social status. Commoners were limited to shoes with toes no longer than 6 inches. Nobles could wear shoes with toes up to 12 inches long. Some fashion extremists wore shoes with toes so long they had to be tied to the knees with chains to prevent tripping. These shoes were impractical, uncomfortable, and expensive. They made walking difficult and running nearly impossible. But that was the point. Wearing poulains showed that you didn't need to work, that you could afford to be impractical. The church condemned poulains as sinful and vain. Some cities passed laws limiting toe length, but fashion prevailed, and poulains remained popular for decades. The trend eventually died out in the late 15th century, replaced by wide, square-toed shoes. But poulains remain one of the most memorable examples of medieval fashion excess. Music was everywhere in medieval life. People sang while working, while traveling, while celebrating. Music was not just entertainment. It was a fundamental part of daily existence. The church was the center of musical culture. Gregorian chant, the official music of the Catholic Church, was sung in monasteries and cathedrals throughout Europe. These chants were monophonic, a single melodic line without harmony, and they were designed to elevate the soul and focus the mind on God. But secular music was just as important. Troubadours and minstrels traveled from town to town, performing songs about love, war, and adventure. These musicians were celebrities, welcomed in noble courts and taverns alike. Instruments included the lute, harp, fiddle, flute, and bagpipes. Yes, bagpipes were popular throughout medieval Europe, not just in Scotland. Dancing was also popular, despite the church's disapproval. People danced at festivals, weddings, and celebrations. The dances were lively and communal, with everyone participating. Music was passed down orally. Most musicians couldn't read musical notation, which was still being developed. They learned songs by ear and improvised variations. The medieval love of music reveals a culture that valued beauty, emotion, and communal experience. Music brought people together, expressed feelings that words couldn't capture, and made life more bearable. Medieval people believed that life could arise spontaneously from non-living matter. This wasn't ignorance. It was based on observation and seemed perfectly logical given what they could see. Maggots appeared on rotting meat. Mice seemed to generate from piles of grain. Frogs emerged from mud. Without microscopes or understanding of reproduction, these observations led to the conclusion that life could spontaneously generate under the right conditions. This belief was supported by ancient authorities like Aristotle, who had written about spontaneous generation. Medieval scholars trusted these authorities and incorporated spontaneous generation into their understanding of the natural world. The belief had practical implications. If mice could generate from grain, then keeping grain clean and dry would prevent mice. If maggots came from rot, then preventing rot would prevent maggots. These conclusions were actually correct, even if the underlying theory was wrong. Spontaneous generation wasn't disproven until the 17th century, when experiments by Francesco Redi and later Louis Pasteur demonstrated that life comes only from life. Medieval agriculture was more sophisticated than most people realize. One of the most important innovations was the three-field system of crop rotation, which dramatically increased agricultural productivity. Before crop rotation, fields were farmed continuously until the soil was exhausted, then left fallow for years to recover. This was inefficient and limited food production. The three-field system divided farmland into three sections. One section was planted with winter crops like wheat or rye. Another was planted with spring crops like oats or barley. The third was left fallow to recover. Each year the fields rotated, so every section got a rest period. This system had multiple benefits. It increased the amount of land under cultivation at any given time. It reduced soil exhaustion. It spread the risk. If one crop failed, the other might succeed. The three-field system was a major factor in the population growth of medieval Europe. More food meant more people, which meant more labor, which meant more economic activity. This innovation shows that medieval people were capable of sophisticated planning and agricultural science. They observed, experimented, and developed systems that worked. While we discussed earlier that medieval people did bathe, there was also a widespread belief that bathing could be dangerous, especially during certain times or conditions. Medieval medical theory held that bathing opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to disease. Doctors warned against bathing during illness, during menstruation, or after eating. They believed that water could enter the body through open pores and cause imbalances in the humors. This belief intensified during plague outbreaks. People thought that bathing would make them more susceptible to the plague, so they avoided it. This actually made things worse, as poor hygiene contributed to the spread of disease. The fear of bathing grew stronger in the early modern period. By the 16th and 17th centuries, many people avoided bathing entirely, relying on perfumes and powders to mask body odor. This belief persisted until the 19th century, when germ theory finally explained how disease actually spread. Once people understood that cleanliness prevented disease rather than causing it, bathing became accepted and encouraged. You might think medieval people stared at the night sky in ignorance, but the truth is, they were expert stargazers. Without city lights, the stars blazed overhead every night, and people learned to read them like a book. Farmers watched the constellations to know when to plant and harvest. Mariners navigated by the North Star, and monks tracked the phases of the moon to set the dates for Easter and other holy days. Medieval scholars built elaborate astrolabes, complex devices of brass and wood that could measure the position of the sun and stars. These weren't just toys for the rich. They were essential tools for anyone who needed to keep time, predict the seasons, or travel long distances. Astrology was a respected science. Kings and queens consulted astrologers before making big decisions, believing the stars could reveal the future. Medical doctors used the position of the planets to diagnose illnesses and choose the best time for treatments. The Church even set the calendar by the heavens, calculating the date of Easter with painstaking precision. Medieval people didn't just look at the stars. They lived by them. The sky was a map, a clock, a calendar, and a source of wonder. They may not have known about galaxies or black holes, but they understood the rhythms of the cosmos in a way that most modern people have forgotten. If you lived in a medieval city, your life was shaped by guilds, powerful organizations of craftsmen and merchants. Guilds controlled everything: who could work, what they could make, how much they could charge, and even who they could marry. To join a guild, you started as an apprentice, working for years under a master. You learned every detail of the trade, from the secrets of dyeing cloth to the art of baking perfect bread. After years of hard work, you became a journeyman, traveling from town to hone your skills. Only the best became masters, allowed to open their own shops and take on apprentices. Guilds weren't just about business. They were brotherhoods, offering support in times of sickness, paying for funerals, and caring for widows and orphans. They built hospitals, sponsored festivals, and even hired musicians for their feasts. But guilds could be ruthless. They protected their secrets fiercely, punishing anyone who broke the rules. They set prices, controlled quality, and shut out outsiders. If you tried to work without guild approval, you could be fined, beaten, or driven out of town. Guilds made medieval cities vibrant, prosperous, and fiercely independent. They were the backbone of urban life, shaping everything from the food you ate to the clothes you wore. Every knight's shield told a story. Heraldry, the art of designing coats of arms, was a complex language of colors, shapes, and symbols. To the untrained eye, a shield was just decoration. But to those in the know, it revealed a knight's family, achievements, and alliances. Colors had meaning: gold for generosity, red for courage, blue for loyalty. Animals and objects told stories: a lion for bravery, a cross for faith, a rose for hope. Even the way a symbol was positioned mattered. A sword pointing up meant readiness for battle, pointing down, peace. Heraldry was everywhere, on banners, clothing, buildings, and even tombstones. It was a way to show off your lineage, claim your rights, and intimidate your enemies. In battle, it helped soldiers recognize friend from foe. In court, it settled disputes over land and inheritance. Learning heraldry was like learning a code. Only the elite could read it fluently, but everyone understood its power. A well-designed coat of arms could open doors, win allies, and strike fear into rivals. Medieval people lived with death every day. Plague, famine, war, and childbirth claimed lives at every turn. The average life expectancy was short, often less than 40 years. But that number hides the reality. Many children died young, but those who survived childhood could live into their 60s or 70s. Death wasn't hidden away. Funerals were public, and cemeteries were in the center of town. People visited the graves of loved ones, prayed for the dead, and believed in the power of relics and saints to protect their souls. Art and literature were obsessed with death. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, showed skeletons leading people of all classes to the grave. Poems and sermons reminded everyone that life was fleeting, and only faith could save you. But medieval people weren't morbid. They celebrated life fiercely, with festivals, music, and laughter. They faced death with courage, humor, and hope, believing that the next world would be better than this one. For many medieval people, the greatest adventure was a pilgrimage, a journey to a holy site to seek forgiveness, healing, or a miracle. Pilgrims traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles, braving bandits, storms, and disease to reach places like Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. Pilgrimage was open to everyone, rich and poor, men and women, young and old. Some went to fulfill a vow, others to escape trouble, and some just for the thrill of the journey. Along the way, they stayed in special inns, wore badges to show their destination, and collected souvenirs to prove they'd made it. Pilgrimage was dangerous, but it was also a chance to see the world, meet new people, and experience the wonders of distant lands. It was a spiritual quest, but also a social and economic phenomenon, fueling trade, building roads, and spreading ideas. The stories pilgrims brought home changed the way people saw the world, opening their minds to new cultures, foods, and beliefs. The medieval church was more than a place to pray. It was the center of every community, controlling education, charity, law, and even politics. The church owned vast lands, collected tithes, and wielded enormous power over kings and peasants alike. Monasteries were centers of learning, preserving ancient texts and teaching reading, writing, and music. Cathedrals were marvels of architecture, built over generations by entire communities. Parish churches marked every village, their bells ringing out the hours and calling people to worship. The church set the calendar, organizing life around feasts, fasts, and holy days. It cared for the sick, fed the poor, and buried the dead. It offered hope in a world full of suffering, promising salvation to those who believed. But the church could also be corrupt, greedy, and cruel. It sold indulgences, punished heretics, and fought wars in the name of God. Its power was both a blessing and a curse, shaping every aspect of medieval life. Medieval women weren't just passive victims. They ran businesses, managed estates, and even ruled kingdoms. Noble women acted as regents when their husbands were away, making decisions about land, money, and justice. Some became queens in their own right, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of Castile. In towns, women worked as brewers, bakers, weavers, and merchants. They joined guilds, signed contracts, and went to court to defend their rights. In the countryside, women managed farms, raised animals, and made everything from clothes to cheese. Women could inherit property, sue for divorce, and choose their own husbands, at least in theory. The reality was often harder, but the law recognized women's rights in ways that would surprise many modern people. Women also played a vital role in religion. They became nuns, abbesses, and mystics, founding convents and writing books. Some were revered as saints, their lives inspiring generations. Medieval women faced enormous challenges, but they found ways to survive, succeed, and shape the world around them. When the Black Death struck Europe in the 14th century, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. The impact was immediate and profound. Fields went unplowed, towns emptied, and entire families vanished. But the plague also brought unexpected changes. With so many people dead, labor became scarce. Peasants could demand higher wages, better conditions, and even freedom from their lords. The old social order began to crumble, and new opportunities opened up for those who survived. The church lost credibility, unable to stop the plague or explain its cause. People began to question authority, experiment with new ideas, and seek answers outside traditional religion. The Black Death was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. It shattered the old world and paved the way for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern age. Not all animals in the Middle Ages were for work or food. Medieval people loved pets, especially dogs and cats. Nobles kept lapdogs, pampered with ribbons and tiny collars. Cats were prized for their ability to catch mice, but they were also beloved companions, curled up by the fire or perched on a windowsill. Birds were popular pets, too. Falcons and hawks were trained for hunting, while songbirds were kept for their beauty and music. Some people even kept monkeys, though these were rare and expensive. Pets appear in medieval art, literature, and even legal documents. They were given names, mourned when they died, and sometimes buried with their owners. The love of pets is a reminder that medieval people were not so different from us. They found comfort, joy, and companionship in the animals they cared for. The last secret is the biggest of all. The Middle Ages never really ended. The world we live in is still shaped by medieval ideas, institutions, and values. Our laws, our languages, our religions, our cities, all have roots in the medieval past. We still use medieval words, celebrate medieval holidays, and live in cities laid out in the Middle Ages. Our universities, parliaments, and churches are direct descendants of medieval institutions. Even our fears and dreams about death, love, justice, and the unknown echo the concerns of people who lived 1,000 years ago. The Middle Ages are not a distant, forgotten era. They are the foundation of our world, the soil from which everything else has grown. So the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were dark, ignorant, or irrelevant, remember these secrets. Remember the complexity, the creativity, the resilience, and the humanity of medieval people. Their world was strange, but it was also rich, vibrant, and full of surprises. And maybe, just maybe, we have more in common with them than we think. Tonight, we've uncovered 50 secrets your teachers never told you about the Middle Ages. We've seen a world of trial by ordeal, chained books, pointy shoes, and beer for breakfast. We've met peasants with more vacation than you, knights who could do somersaults in armor, and women who ruled kingdoms. The medieval world was brutal, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating. It was a world of faith and fear, of suffering and joy, of darkness and light. It was a world not so different from our own. So as the fire burns low and the night grows deep, remember, history is full of secrets, waiting to be discovered. The past is never really past. It's alive, all around us, shaping who we are and who we will become. Rest easy tonight, knowing that the world is stranger, richer, and more wonderful than you ever imagined. And now you know.